So, when looking at the surveys from the Pew Research Center that was on the question, one thing that stands out was that the evangelical Christians in the U.S. tend to distrust climate science more than any other group. And truthfully, I don't think that's because they don't care or aren't thoughtful people. I think it's more about like the culture and politics and the faith itself. And so in the U.S., being evangelical has kind of become tied to a certain political identity, and climate change is usually political, like government control, regulations, etc. So it's easy for people to assume that like science itself is part of that agenda, but once science feels political, I think people will naturally start to question it, even if the science isn't actually making like political claims. And then another piece of it is the authority. A lot of evangelicals are taught to be cautious of anything that seems like it might challenge the Bible. And when climate change is really extreme or like seen in those ways, it can feel like it's replacing God with human fear or human control. And so instead of being seen as information about how the world works, I think climate science can feel like a competing worldview. And I've also and then my second question was to answer why worry about the environment? Jesus is coming back anyways. And I think that idea definitely exists in some Christian spaces, but the logic behind that, since the world isn't permanent, the logic is basically that the world isn't permanent, so caring for it doesn't really matter in the long run. But that perspective doesn't line up with the Bible, I think. From the very beginning, humans are described as caretakers of creation. In Genesis, God tells humans to tend the garden, not own it, not exploit it, but just take care of it. And that command doesn't come with an expiration date at all. And I think being stewards isn't about how long something lasts, but it's about being faithful with what you're given. And also, Jesus never treats the future as an excuse to ignore the present. And then even though us as Christians believe in eternity, I think Jesus still spends his ministry caring for people who are suffering right now. And environmental damage usually affects the poorest and the most vulnerable people first, through things like food shortages and unsafe water and extreme weather. And so ignoring it kind of ignores those people, which is the people that Jesus took care of. And there's always something kind of backwards about believing creation is made by God, but then acting like it's disposable. And so Romans even talks about creation groaning and waiting for redemption, which suggests that God actually cares about the physical world and not just souls, but the whole thing. So I think the way to reconcile belief in Jesus' return with environmental care is that realizing being a steward isn't about trying to save the world on our own, but it's about being obedient and caring for the environment because God asked us to care for what he made, and not just because we think we can control the future by controlling climate change or something. And so I think just listening more and doing stuff like that would really help. But at the end of the day, living out Christian faith means acting like what we do now matters, because it does, even if we believe God ultimately holds the future and we may go to heaven and stuff like that.